Here we go. All right. Thank you for inviting me and the good introduction. My name is Jim Worley, and I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is March 5th, 1989. My home group is the First Things First group in Cancun, Mexico. Today, we're going to talk about writing the big...
Jim. Hi, Jim.
Hi, hi.
Hi.
Hi, Jim. Hi.
What?
No, we just say
hi.
hi.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Today, we're going to talk about the writing the big book, the process, because Bill did not go to the bookstore and find the book. He had to write it, and it was a process. And we're going to talk about Bill and his story. The big book is a story, and it was written in 1938 and published in 1939. In 2019, a new book came out called Writing the Big Book. It's a history book, a history of writing the big book. It is based on 11 years of research in the A.A. archives, letters and history of the time of writing the big book, 1938 and 1939. It was written by a man named Bill Shaberg, Bill S. So we have Bill W. telling his story, and Bill S. talking about his story. Ernie Kurtz, A.A. historian Ernie Kurtz, talks about the importance of A.A. history. Those who have no memory have no hope. Preserving A.A.'s history, its story, is our most important task. For whether we be alcoholics or simply lovers of A.A., it is by telling and hearing their stories that Alcoholics Anonymous heals alcoholics and passes on its wisdom. Alcoholics Anonymous is its members, and its story and its members' stories are one and the same. A.A. is storytelling. Me telling my story to you, and you telling your story to me. History is important because story is important. And few existing entities better demonstrate or more deeply realize the importance of story than the storytelling program and fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. History is important because those who have no memory have no hope. There is a link between memory and hope. Both are fragile, and so each sustains the other, and each needs all the help it can get from the other. And this is why the real story of Alcoholics Anonymous is important. We need hope, and our hope is founded in memory. And because memory is fallible and easily deceived, we need archives and history to help our memory. Because sometimes memory remembers what the present wants to hear. I don't know about you, but sometimes when I tell my story in meetings, I don't tell all the details, and sometimes I forget. And so that happens to us when we are telling our stories. And that's why written history is important, and the archives. Story and storytelling are at the very heart of Alcoholics Anonymous. AA's basic text and voices at meetings disclose in a general way what we used to be like, what happened, and what we are like now. From the meeting with the two desperate men, Bill and Bob, in the mid-1930s, to today's growing varieties of AA experience, the history of AA is a story about stories and the healing power of mutual storytelling. First of all, I'm going to start right at the beginning and talk about, in this history book called Writing the Big Book, which I highly recommend. It's a history book based on facts and letters and the history from the GSO archives. The book Alcoholics Anonymous, the story of how many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism, is one of the most important and influential spiritual works published in the 20th century. It describes a clear path that alcoholics, problem drinkers who are unable to quit drinking, can follow to achieve sobriety and live a life free of alcohol. In the first 4 years of Alcoholics Anonymous, 1935 to 1938, 3 years, when they started writing the big book, there was a lot of flying blind. They didn't have steps. They didn't have a book. They just tried a lot of things, trial and error. And sometimes memory is defective and self-deceptive. Attention is not always paid, and when it is, dates are regularly misremembered, while details are forgotten, left out, or compounded beyond recognition. In short, any portrayal of the big book's history that relies on A.A.'s well-worn stories, old stories that we have heard, is doomed to tell an inaccurate tale. In contrast, the history presented in the book, The Writing of the Big Book, is based on contemporary evidence rather than later recollections. Bill Wilson was a storyteller. The primary revelation from this kind is the investigation is that Bill Wilson, the man who contributed more information than anyone else to the traditional story, was by far the worst offender when it came to accuracy regarding that early history. Bill was not a historian. He was a storyteller. He was telling the story of what happened. And sometimes when you tell your story, when I tell my story, I leave out a lot of the details because they get in the way of the story. I want a clear, understanding story. And Bill was a storyteller. He used parables, like other teachers use parables and stories, to make a point. In the A.A. book, Pass It On, it talks about it. Bill would tidy up a story. And there it says, as the author of Pass It On says, Bill Wilson was certainly never reluctant to stretch a fact for the sake of emphasis, and he often spoke in metaphor rather than relating events as they actually happened. And he was very bad on dates. He was not a historian. He is telling a story of how he was saved and how other people can be saved from alcoholism. Our book starts off saying, Alcoholics Anonymous is the story of how many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism. And it looks, there's the Bill's story. But the big book, writing the big book was a process. Here is what it appears to be in our book. Chapter 1, Bill's story. However, here is how it started. Bill started writing called The Strange Obsession, and he wrote, it was a hot night in midsummer in 1934. And he writes 8 pages of it, handwritten. That's how Bill's story started out. Well, he didn't like that, and so he threw it away and started over again. And on this story, this is called his original Bill's story. And it starts out, when I was about 10 years old, my father and mother agreed to disagree, and I went to live with my grandfather and grandmother. So there are about 3 different attempts or stories that Bill wrote before he finally arrived at his story. As we know, these are just some pictures of the original manuscript. After they had made a lot of changes and talked a lot of things over, they typed it up and sent it out to different people. And these are some of the changes that were made to the original Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. You can see that there were a lot of changes made. Here is how it works. And how it works was originally directed at you. Here are some of the steps that you have to take. Here is God, you must find him now. There were a lot of changes made. A lot of things were handwritten by Bill and by another person who helped him by the name of Hank Parkhurst. He helped Bill with the writing, not so much the writing as the editing and outlines and of the Big Book. Although Hank did write the chapter to employers. So Dorothy Snyder, who was Clarence Snyder's wife, said, she wrote a letter to Bill one time and she said, well, Bill, this is going back, but one of the things I feel vitally important is to get the story of how the book was actually written. We get so many distorted stories on the West Coast. People talk about 100 men that wrote the book. Actually, there weren't 100, as Bill will bear me out. And he said 100 to make it sound good, as though it was really going to work. The people talk as though there were 100 men. They all went saintly and were taken straight up to heaven, and God just guided Bill's hand. The Bill just sat there and let the words come through. Actually, it wasn't anything like that at all. So we're going to let Bill tell his story, Bill Wilson. He gave this talk in 1954 in Fort Worth, Texas. And this is the best story he ever told about writing the Big Book. And he said, he started out, he said, I would just like to spin some yarn, which is kind of like a story. And they will be a series of yarns which cluster around the preparation of the good old A.A. Bible. And when I hear that, it always makes me shudder, because the guys who put it together weren't a damn bit biblical. I think sometimes some of the drunks have an idea that these old timers went around with almost visible halos and long gowns, and they were full of sweetness and light. Oh boy, how inspired they were. Oh yes. But wait till I tell you, Bill says. He says, I suppose the book story started in the living room of Doc and Annie Smith in the summer of 1935. A little group caught hold. As you know, I landed there. I helped Smithy briefly with it, and he went on to found the first AA group in the world. And as with all new groups, it was nearly all failure in the beginning. But now and then somebody saw the light and there was progress. And I went back to New York. A little more experienced group started there in New York, and by the time we got around to 1937, this thing had leaped a little over into Cleveland and began to move south into New York, but it was still, we thought in those years, a flying blind period, a flickering candle. That's Bob and Ann Smith's living room. So on this late fall afternoon in 1937, this is Bill talking. Smithy and I were talking together in his living room, and Ann, his wife, sitting there when we began to count noses. How many people had stayed dry in Akron and in New York? Maybe a few in Cleveland. How many had stayed dry and for how long? And when we added up the total, it sure was a handful of, I don't know, 35 or 40 maybe. Here's a list of the first 40 people. A lot of them were failures in the beginning, but these were the first 40, 35 or 40. Bill always liked bigger numbers. Now, at this same time, just real quickly, at this same time, 1937 and 1938, Bill was looking for a job. Besides AA, he had to make money to eat. And he was out and he got a little job for a while at a place out in Indiana as a director of kind of a business, but he didn't really work at it very much. But there in Akron, he said, I can never forget the elation and ecstasy that seized us both. We sat happily talking and reflecting. They had 35 or 40 drunks after 3 years, after about 2.5 years. 2.5 years and 30 people had gotten sober. There was an immense amount of failure and had taken a long time to sober up that handful. But we figured out not all the drunks in the world can come to Akron and New York. How can we transmit the message to them? So it was obvious that because drunks are such unlovely creatures, we would have to get a great chain of hospitals. Bill always thought big. So he wanted a chain of hospitals. And as that dream burst upon me, it sounded good. And this was a time when chain drugstores and chain grocery stores were becoming popular. So that evening they were talking, and Bob and I told them that we were in sight of success and that we thought this thing might go on and on. At that point, they turned the meeting over to me. And being a salesman, I set right to work on the drunk tanks and subsidies for the missionaries. So they decided they needed a book, and they needed to pay missionaries to go out, and they needed a chain of hospitals. Bill was thinking big at this meeting of the alcoholics. The group conscience of 18 men, good and true, they were damned skeptical, Bill says. Almost with one voice, they said, let's keep it simple. This is going to bring money into this, and it'll ruin it. And he said, well, that's a good argument. But within very close to here in this house, alcoholics are dying like flies. If this thing doesn't move any faster than it did in the last 3 years, it may be another years before it gets to the outskirts of Akron. Now, how in God's name are we going to carry this message to others? So exerting myself to the utmost, Bill says, which was considerable in those days, we finally got a vote in that little meeting, and it was a mighty close vote. By just a majority of 2 or 3, the meeting said, well, Bill, if we need a lot of money, you better go back to New York. So I went back to the great city, and I began to approach people of means, describing the tremendous thing that had happened. So he got their permission barely by 8 to 10 vote. He got permission to do something and to work on a book. So now we're going to talk about the difference between history and story. So that is in green is where we're going to talk about history, archived, documented history. So only one of these 3 ambitious proposals, Bill proposed a book, paid missionaries, and a chain of hospitals. Only one of them ever became a reality. It's an appealing and lively story, and Bill got up and made a great speech, and he convinced them all, and he won. He won his point, and it's a wonderful story that builds with suspense and drama and builds with victory in the final vote. The problem is that many of the details are simply not true. And even more important, Bill leaves out many important facts and critical factors that are essential to the story. Almost all the particulars in his vision of that October are contradicted by contemporary documents. Contrary to Bill Wilson's frequent retelling of the story, he did not go to Ohio alone. He and Lois went, and he brought people from New York with him to help convince the others. So he didn't go alone and make this big speech. He took his friends from New York with him to help make his point. It remains a matter of speculation as to whether Fitz Mayo, Sterling Parker, and Bill Riddell from New York actually voted. But all of Lois's diaries from this period are missing. So we don't know a lot of that, but we do know some other things from letters from that time. So anyway, back to Bill now. So Bill says he went back to New York, and I began to approach people. So he's trying to get money, and these people were saying, well, we already give to the American Red Cross, and drunks, they kind of cause their own problem. Why should we give money to 35 or 40 drunks who've gotten sobered up in 3 years? So he didn't have much luck, and he said he began to get upset, and when he gets upset, his stomach bothered him. He would get upset, and he thought he had an ulcer, and that's like when he wrote the 12 steps, he had stomach trouble. But anyway, he was having stomach trouble, and he said, my God, we're starving to death here in the house, and Lois is working, and the drunks are hanging around and eating at the house. So he said, the next morning I crawled into my clothes and called my brother-in-law, Dr. Leonard Strong. And he's a doctor, and he's about the last person who followed was a friend of Bill when he was still drinking. So he went to see Dr. Leonard Strong. And so I started, and Bill started complaining to his brother-in-law about his stomach ache and those rich guys who wouldn't give us any money to help out the drunks. And, at that time, he said, well, gee, I don't know what I can do. But he said, well, I know this man, Willard Richardson, and he's a friend of John D. Rockefeller's, and maybe we could go talk to him. And so Leonard, his brother-in-law, listened, and then he took him to another doctor, Dr. Shirley Wilmot Wynn, and then they eventually he also said, well, why don't you go to talk to John D. Rockefeller? And of course, Bill said, well, how about the Prince of Wales? He thought John D. Rockefeller was an impossible person to talk to. But he did. He went to see Willard Richardson, who was a friend of Rockefeller's. So they went to Rockefeller Plaza, and they went up to 54 stories to the Rockefeller room to talk to Willard Richardson. They had lunch with Willard Richardson, and he went over this. We went over this thing again about we need money. We're trying to save the drunks. And then there were some other people that were involved, Frank Amos in the advertising business, and L. Leroy Chipman. And these were also Rockefeller men. And they eventually did help Bill with some money. So there was a meeting that was arranged at 30 Rockefeller Plaza after this. And they got a couple of alcoholics from Akron, and Dr. Bob Smith came to the meeting in New York, and Dr. Silkworth came, and some of the drunks from Akron and some of the alcoholics from New York. And they had this meeting with the Rockefeller people to try and talk them into some money to help get A.A. started and to write a book. And the Rockefeller man said pretty much the same thing as the people in Akron. He said, well, this sounds good, but if we give you money, it might hurt the program. And but Bill says we talked to them about these gentlemen for missionaries and drunk tanks in the book. And so they decided, one of them decided to investigate and report back to the Rockefeller people. After he reported back to John D. Rockefeller, he recommended that the friends of ours, that we should have at least a token amount of money at first, say $50,000. So they recommended to John D. Rockefeller that to give A.A. $50,000. Now, $50,000 in 1938 is about 1 million US dollars today. So $50,000 was a lot of money. And Dr. Richardson and some of the others said, well, we'd like to help you, but John D. Rockefeller said, we'll give you $5,000. And that's to help Dr. Bob in Akron. And that's a picture of John D. Rockefeller. And he put $5,000 in the Riverside Church Treasury to help Dr. Bob and Akron out there. And he said, Bill says, well, this thing needed a lot of money. What would we do without it? So they decided they were going to set up an alcoholic foundation to raise money. And they had a problem because they didn't know the difference between an alcoholic and a non-alcoholic. Legally, they were set up this foundation. How do you tell who's a drunk and who isn't? And the lawyer couldn't figure it out either. So when they set up the trustees, as they still have, they used, instead of saying non-alcoholic and alcoholic trustees, they just said Class A and Class B, because legally there's no definition of an alcoholic. So we had this wonderful new foundation, Bill says, and now we're connected with the Rockefeller Foundation. So we went to other businesses and tried to get other ones to help us, and we printed a brochure and trying to get some money to help get things going and to write a book. And Bill says, and we didn't get 1 damn cent in the whole summer of 1938. Praise God. So with Bill says in yellow there at the bottom, mortgage, and Bill had a mortgage and Dr. Smith had a mortgage, and they had to eat. And so that $5,000 didn't last very long. So in the summer of 1938, Bill started writing his story, and there is a solution. He wrote 2 chapters. He wrote Bill's story. As we saw before, he had several different versions before he finally ended up with the final story. But he wrote Bill's story, and he wrote the chapter, There is a Solution. And he wrote them as to promote the book. And they were going to sell those 2 chapters to people for $1 and see if they could raise money. So the first copies of these 2 chapters are sent out in an effort to raise money from a New York banker. And one of the things we're going to talk about when he wrote his story is E.B. Thatcher's visit. And this is a story written by Bill Wilson. Bill's story was written by Bill, and it's Bill's story. What actually happened is different, because E.B. Thatcher told the story of that visit, and it's completely different from Bill's story. And Lois also wrote about the visit, and her story is different. And Abby's story says, Abby said, so I called him up one night and I didn't get Bill, but I got Lois and told her what had happened. And she said, why don't you come over for dinner? So Bill didn't go over and talk to Abby in the kitchen. He went over for dinner that night and had dinner. So he said, I went over at 5:30 and I rang the bell, and the man who worked there said, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson are not here. So, but come on in. And Bill finally arrived there, and he'd been drinking, but he wasn't too drunk. And then Abby says, so then Lois came in, and another girl was invited, a girl that lived upstairs in an apartment they rented out. So they all sat down to dinner. And E.e.y says, and Bill's got it a little garbled in the book about us being across the kitchen table. That didn't really happen. But what Bill said, later on, as E.e.y was leaving, he walked him to the subway. He walked E.e.y to the subway, and Bill said, I don't know what you've got, but I want to get it too. So Bill had listened and to what E.e.y had talked about. And he stopped drinking, at least for a while, right away. And E.e.y said he told his version of that evening in Brooklyn on several different occasions, and always acknowledging, he said, that the story you read in the big book is a little different. He once explained why it's different, and he said, well, I was sober and Bill was drunk. Maybe that has something to do about the story being different. But the short answer is that Bill Wilson was taking one of his experiences and turning it into a story with a message that would in no way be complicated or confused by messy details of what actually happened. The point of Bill's much simpler, more direct, and comprehensible story is to dramatically present one of the most basic foundational beliefs of Alcoholics Anonymous, that one alcoholic could affect another as no non-alcoholic did have. His story about E.e.y's visit does this admirably. You have two people sitting at a kitchen table, and their entire conversation is devoted to how his friend can successfully take in control of his drinking. If you count the pages, you will see that about 50% of Bill's story is the kitchen table talking to E.e.y visit. That's what it's about 50% of Bill's story. That's the important part. One alcoholic can help another alcoholic as nobody else can. So it's a parable. It's a story without a lot of details, and it's a truth about A.A.'s beginnings. One alcoholic helping another alcoholic like no other person can. Another thing in the other chapter that Bill wrote in May of 1938 in June is the chapter, There is a Solution. In the first, there are several versions of this. He would write it, and then he would rewrite it, and he would change it and make it better according to him. In There is a Solution, the word religious appears 13 times, and the word spiritual never appears in the first version. By the time the book was published, those numbers had changed. Now religious appears just 7 times, and spiritual is used to replace the word religious. So the word, I did that already. So he's taking out the word religious and using the word spiritual. So in July of 38, Bill spends the month collecting favorable testimonials about A.A.'s success. The letter written by Dr. Silkworth was in July of 1938. And he writes about his white light experience and what happened in the hospital. In August, he also sends Dr. Bob advice on how the Akron people should write their stories for the book. He says, I want everyone should write at whatever length they want. So most of the stories in the first edition of the big book came from Akron. Also, Bill sends Dr. Bob the first drafts, versions of More About Alcoholism and We Agnostics. That's in September 28th of 1938. So he's writing and then he changes it and he revises it. Another thing on the doctor's opinion, in the first edition, the doctor's opinion appeared on page 1 and Bill's story appeared on page 10. Okay. When the second edition came out, Bill changed that and made Bill's story #1 and the doctor's opinion Roman numerals. But in the first edition, the doctor's opinion was page 1. So one day, probably in August of 1938, Bill says, I produced a couple of chapters of the proposed book, and we still had those 2 chapters kicking around. And Frank Amos, one of the Rockefeller men, said, I have a friend named Gene Exman, and he works at Harper's, a publication house. He said, why don't we take these 2 chapters to him and see what he thinks of them? And so they went to see Eugene Chapman, who became a huge friend of both Bill and A.A. And he said, Mr. Wilson, could you write a whole book like this? And Bill said, sure. You know, he'd never written anything before. And Harper's said that they would pay me, Bill, $1,500 as an advance if I gave them the story. So they talked about it, and primarily Hank, but also Bill, decided they didn't want to take money and let someone else publish it. They wanted to publish it themselves. So this guy, Hank, he said, Bill, this is something, come with me. And they walked into a stationery store to buy a pad of blank stock certificates. And they would write across them Works Publishing Company and sell shares of stock for $25. And what they did in the beginning was 200 shares would go to Hank Parkhurst and 200 shares to Bill Wilson, and they would sell 200 shares to pay for the book. But both Hank and Bill were going to be owners of the company. Historically, this is, again, the original certificates were not for Works Publishing. Bill always said it were, but I even verified this with A.A. archives. And the name of the company was the 100 Men Corporation and not Works Publishing Company. They did a brochure to sell the writing the big book. And the name Works Publishing didn't appear until February of 1939. So Bill goes on and he says, well, we've been looking at printing costs and you know, we're going to have a book of 400 pages and it'll sell for $3.50 and it'll only cost us 35 cents. So if you buy, you know, we're going to sell train car loads full of these books, and you guys are going to get rich if you buy stock. So anyway, they didn't have too much luck in the beginning selling stock to drunks, especially when most of them didn't have any money. So we get the idea to go to Reader's Digest, a big popular magazine in those days. And Reader's Digest, they talked to them and said, will you publicize our book if we print it? And they said, well, that sounds like a good idea. I'll talk to the editors and see. So they went back to the drunks and said, now, Mr. Payne from Reader's Digest says they're going to give us publicity. And so, boy, you can't miss investing in this company. You need to buy stock. So they started selling some stock. Bill says we began to sell shares of Works Publishing. Well, it wasn't Works, but not yet incorporated. They didn't even have it set up as a company. And $5 a month to poor people. Some people would buy as little as one. One guy bought 10 shares. We sold a few shares to non-alcoholics, and my promoter friend, who was to get 1/3 interest, was a very important man in this transaction. And we went out collecting money from the drunks. And so little Ruth Hawk, the secretary, and I could keep working on the book. And so Lois could have some money to feed the drunks. So the preparation started and the chapters were done. And we went into AA meetings in New York with these chapters. And Bill says, he said, I was just the umpire, that the alcoholics in the meetings would argue about everything that he had written. And I finally had to say, well, boys, over here you got the holy rollers, the people that wanted it to be a book all about God and Christianity. And then we've got other people that want it to be a psychological book. And so I guess you'll have to leave it up to me just to be the umpire in these arguments about what goes into the book. It says, so we fought and bled and died our way through one chapter after another. We sent them out to Akron, and they went around Akron, and they checked them out there in Akron, and they argued about this word and that word, and again, we interrupt Bill to listen to a little bit of history. The stories about the big book being a collective work of 100 people is just not true. The people in Akron contributed very little. In fact, Dr. Bob didn't show most people about what was being written in the book because the Akron people didn't like the book. They didn't want a book. So he kind of didn't even say that. And in the meetings, there wasn't really a whole lot of argument. Where the people who did disagree with Bill were Hank Parkhurst and Fitz Mayo. Fitz wanted a religious book, and Hank wanted a psychological book. And the two of them did argue with Bill about what he wrote, but not everyone did. And there was Bill Shaberg, who wrote this, said he found a letter written by Hank Parkhurst 17 days before the book came out. And this was a letter, and he said, Bill, you've got to make changes. If you don't, I'll form a committee and we'll make them for you. So Hank was making a power play to change things in the book before it went to printing. So it talks about the 100 men who argued about the book in the meetings. It didn't happen. But there was some arguing with Hank and one or two other people. Out in Akron, Jim Scott was an old newspaper man, and he helped the Akron people write their stories and to polish them up. And a lot of times, Jim Scott would just take one of these Akron people out for coffee and listen to them tell their story, and then he'd write the story for them. So there were by November, 3 more chapters are sent to Dr. Bob. Bill says, I'm turning this stuff out as fast as I can. He says, only once corrected dictation. You can't call it serious writing. And he says, I'll correct it later. And now Bill goes on with his story. He says, then there came the night when we were up around chapter 5. As you know, I'd gone on about myself, Bill's story, which was natural after all. And then the little introductory chapter, there is a solution, and we dealt with the agnostic and more about alcoholism. But boy, we finally got to the point where we really needed to say what the book was all about and how this deal works. As I told you, this was a 6-step program then. On this particular evening, I was lying in bed on Clinton Street, wondering what the deuce was the next chapter would be about. And we need a definite statement of concrete principles that these drunks can't wiggle out of. And this 6-step program had 2 big gaps in it. In between, they'd wiggle out of. So this book had to go out to distant readers. You know, this was so that people far away could read it and get sober. This was while I was thinking these thoughts, while my imaginary ulcer was paining me, and while I was mad as hell at these drunks because the money was coming in too slow. Some had the stock and weren't paying up. A couple of guys came in, and the guy gave me a big argument and about the 12 steps. We had 6, and now I made it 12, and we yelled and shouted at each other. And sorry, one more interruption. Did Bill say 6 steps? there were a lot of changes in the book. First of all, the first time that Bill ever mentioned any 6 steps was in 1949. He never talked about any 6 steps existing before that. And of all of the stories in the first edition of the big book, none of them mention any steps. Not 6, not 12, not 3. They didn't have any steps. And, some things were changed. Here's a change that was made in Fitz's story. Fitz, his first story said, there were some of us sitting around playing bridge, 2 other alcoholics and a drug addict. And then a man asked me, he said, can you be absolutely honest, absolutely pure, absolutely unselfish, and absolutely loving in all your relationships with your fellow man to get rid of the drink problem? This was Fitz's first story. By the time that the book was published, it was now 4 alcoholics in a smoke-filled room. They got rid of the drug addict. And instead of the guy asking him, can you live with the 4 absolutes? He then asked me, he said, if I can call the power God, Allah, Confucius, prime cause, divine mind. So things changed from the first version to the last version because things changed from 1935 to 1939. There's, and in Earl's story, it also mentions the 6 steps. And of course, that wasn't written until 1955. So we don't have enough time to look at all of it, but the 6 steps probably didn't exist. They were using a lot of the Oxford group programs that we talked about earlier. I think we talked about last week, the 5 C's, confidence and conviction and confession and those sort of things. But there were really no 6 steps. And even Bill says later, he said, Ebby gave me some 6 steps when he visited in November. There just were no 6 steps at that time. Like I said, the first they're ever mentioned is 1949, like 15 years after AA started. And again, just to mention this, and you'll see things on the internet, also in Pass It On, and in AA Comes of Age. Bill tells the story about the 6 steps. And so if Bill says it, it has to be true. And it's in AA conference approved literature. Pass It On, AA Comes of Age. And, there are things like this on the internet. This note that he sent to Father Ed, about here are the 6 steps that we used. But again, there's no mention of these 6 steps before 1949, and they are not mentioned in any of the stories from the big book. And there were 30 stories in the first edition of the big book. And there were 3 things. You admitted you were powerless, you were licked, you were defeated, and that you surrendered your life to God and you acted accordingly, like praying, meditating, making amends, other parts of the basically Oxford group program. But there was no 6-step program, and the Oxford group did not have a 6-step program. And again, in Earl Treat's story, again, that's 1955, AA looking back at 1935 and saying, this is, Dr. Bob took me through the 6-step program as it was at that time. And there was no 6-step program at that time. it was the Oxford group. So, and it was 18 years later that this story was written. Also, other historians, Ernie Kurtz, Glenn Chestnut, and Dick B. all agree that there were no six-step program in early AA. In 1948, Bill and Lois are on a train and they're with a guy named Paul Hennessy. And Paul's going to give a speech at a banquet on Fitzmayo. And Paul says he wanted to hear the story about the evolution of the 12 steps. And he asked for details. And Bill's story about what happened was so impressive that he wanted to get it in writing. But it did not mention 12 steps or 6 steps. And now we return to the personal story. Well, we've already talked about that one. If anyone who is interested on YouTube, there is Bill Shaberg goes through this. It's an hour-long YouTube, but it's talking about the 6th step and how it was a story that Bill created later on. And he did it for several different reasons, but mainly to make it simpler and to not say we were following the Oxford group, because as we'll get to later, Bill wanted to avoid anything related to the Oxford group in the big book. So there's a YouTube story by Bill Shaberg called Creating a Story, the 6th Step Myth, if you are interested. And by December, so Bill is writing the 12 steps with his imaginary ulcer, and he's mad at the drunks. And so he wasn't in a real spiritual mood, but he says he wrote them all in 30 minutes. And so he said he got a pad of paper by the bed, yellow paper, and he reached for it and he said, you got to break this down into small pieces. And that's what he did. Now, by the time these get in print, a lot of things get changed later on. If you look, let's see, on the left side, they're at the top. Half measures will avail you nothing. You stand at the turning point. This is all directed directly at the newcomer. And you must put yourself under his protection and care with complete abandon. And he says, now we think you can take it. Here are the steps we took, which are suggested as your program of recovery. Skip down to step number 7, for example. Originally said, humbly on our knees, asked him to remove our shortcomings, holding nothing back. And there are a lot of things that were changed in that process. So out of the hassle came the 12 steps, Bill says, and the argument caused the introduction of a phrase which has been a lifesaver to thousands. And he said, it was certainly not my doing. I was on the pious side then, more religious then. You see, still suffering from this big hot flash of mine. He says, the idea of God as you understand him came out of that perfectly ferocious argument, and it has saved many alcoholics. God as you understand him came out of these arguments, and it has saved many lives. So, well, little by little, things got on around. The drunks put in money. We kept an office in Newark. That's an old picture of the office building. And Ruth Hawk, the secretary, she worked for no pay. They would give her a share of stock every week instead of money. We gave her plenty of stock in Works Publishing. And I visited that building in 2019. And on the outside, there's a plaque that says, at this site in 1938, excuse me, the book Alcoholics Anonymous was written. From the beginning, a worldwide society would take its name. Alcoholics Anonymous has since helped millions of men and women recover from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body known as alcoholism. Dr. Esther Loring Richards. She was someone else who edited. There were a lot of non-alcoholics who contributed to the writing and editing of the big book. She was Dr. Richards and the psychiatrist, Dr. Leslie Holman, were two psychiatrists who helped to edit the book. There's an actual quote from Dr. Lohman on page 43 of the big book, where he says, I think people like you are utterly hopeless without spiritual help, without religious help. So those two psychiatrists also helped with the editing. Probably the person who, with the most effect, was Tom Uzzell. And in December of 38, he was an editor, not an alcoholic, but he helped. Hank Parkhurst hired him to edit the book so that it would be more professional. Now, if you look there where the little yellow arrow says, according to Bill Wilson, Uzzell sharpened up the English but didn't change much of anything except to take my story out of the story section where it had been the number one story and insisted on using it to open the book. So Bill's story was originally in the back of the book with the other stories. His was first, Dr. Bob's was second, and Tom Uzzell said, we need to put your story as chapter 1 because you're going to say what the solution is, but tell us what the problem is first. So he was the one that said, we need to put Bill's story as number 1. And what about the New York stories? There was a lot of amateur attempts at editing. Again, Hank Parkhurst did a lot of editing with the stories from the New York members who sent their stories in for the big book. Some of them, this is one of the versions of Fitzmayo's story, Our Southern Friend, and how it was edited one time. Hank also made one truly important addition to Bill's story. The most important change made to the book during the review process was the addition of 4 completely new paragraphs that were added to Bill's story. These were not originally in Bill's story. They were written across the first 2 blank pages of the original working manuscript in Hank Parkhurst's distinctive hand. This part was not originally written by Bill Wilson. The part that says, despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice. The word God still aroused a certain antipathy. When the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. Okay? And I didn't like it. I didn't like the idea of a God. And my friend suggested the novel idea, why don't you choose your own conception of God? This was not originally in Bill's story. These 4 paragraphs. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. And these 4 paragraphs were written by Hank Parkhurst on the manuscript. Bill Wilson then goes on to say in January, said, okay, we've got a manuscript. We've got all this put together now and in one place, and it's all typed up, and it's called Alcoholics Anonymous, the original manuscript. So he said, well, shouldn't we test this thing and try it out? So they sent out, Bill says, about 400 copies of the original manuscript, and he sent them to psychiatrists and doctors, and he says housewives and policemen and drunks and the Catholic Committee on Publications and ministers and doctors. They sent it out to everybody, and we got this pre-publication copy made, and they wanted everybody's feedback. Tell us what you think about this. And they had a lot of people who suggested a lot of changes. Actually, the Catholic Church only recommended one, if I remember right. Bill had originally said in his story that this is like heaven, and he changed it to utopia because the Catholic Church said, "Well, heaven's our business," So Bill changed the word heaven to utopia. But he sent out these manuscripts, and as I mentioned, there was a lot of direct language in there. You must do this. You must do that. And the doctors, the psychiatrist Harry Tiebout and Dr. Silkworth, said, you have to do it differently. Don't say you have to do this. What you need to do is say, this is what we did. This is what we did. We ought to, we should. Instead of the authoritarian word you, use the word we. Dr. Silkworth and Dr. Tiebout offered similar advice. The main one was Dr. James Howard, and he was the one that said, you have to get rid of this. You must do this. Because he said the alcoholics won't like it. And again, these were just a lot of the changes that were made to the original made, but changes because alcoholics, doctors, psychiatrists, ministers, priests, they didn't want anything in there that, number one, was not true medically, for example, or that might not be true in 20 years, or anything that might offend anyone. And so they made a lot of changes to that. So the book inspection came, the stories came in, and so now we've got ready. We've got up to printing time, Bill says, and we still had to get it printed. So we go to Cornwall Press, which was the largest printer in the world, and we asked about printing, and they said they'd be glad to do it. And how many books would we like? Well, it's a little bit more interesting than that. In early April 1939, Bill, Hank, Ruth Hawk, the secretary, and Dorothy Snyder traveled to Cornwall to make the final edits to the big book. Hank has many suggestions for last-minute changes, but Bill makes all the final decisions on what goes into the book and what doesn't. So let me go back to a couple of, this is what they gave the printer. They gave him a marked up, changed copy and said, this is what we want to print. And the printer said, are you crazy? You have to retype it. We don't know how to interpret that. We don't know what you mean. And so these four people went there to tell the printer exactly what they wanted. This is the full copy. Bill, Hank, and Ruth set out in Hank's car on Wednesday, March 29th, and drove 60 miles to Cornwall, New York. And Ruth said, they went in a car. We couldn't afford anyone to correct the pages as they came off, edit them. And so the three of us had gone to work on that. And so Bill claimed that Dorothy Snyder, who was, she'd been promoting the book in Cleveland, was going to be in town. And so let's invite her. They'd gone up, Ruth Hawk says, the three of us had gone up to Cornwall, and Dorothy Snyder had a sister, and she'd come to visit, as had Bill, and she called Bill, and she was in town. And Bill said, come on up, And I must say, Ruth Hawk says, like most men of good taste, Bill liked pretty girls too. And Dorothy was a lovely, warm, just humorous, full of humor, full of laughter person. And he liked Dorothy very much. So there we were, the four of us. When Dorothy rode up with him and took a later train, Bill and Hank arrived in Cornwall. and proudly presented their marked up multi-lith copy. Can you imagine a printer? Look at that. Anyway, the print manager was shocked, and they said this was impossible to read. So, speaking to Bill, Dorothy said, speaking to Bill later in a letter, she says, "Bill, I can still see you. We were reading parts of it, different phrases to you, and you'd weigh those phrases. And did this really say what you meant? Would it really help somebody? Would it offend this group or that group or other groups?" And after one of these discussions, Hank was sort of pounding at you that a certain phrase was perhaps too strongly put. I can still hear you say, "Well, I don't want the thing to be so insipid that they don't get the idea of what they have to do to get sober." So here they are, Bill and Hank, the two guys and two girls. Bill, Ruth, Dorothy bond with Hank, and before spent the day working with Cornwall press compositors, and they all had dinner together before turning in for the night, a night which produced a charming story about Bill and these two ladies. Although Ruth and Dorothy had just met, they immediately developed a perfect rapport. So much so that Ruth claimed it was as though they'd known each other all our lives. Well, just to get your attention, Bill ends up in bed with both of those women. Now the story. This was unfortunate since the two women were to share not just a room, but a large bed for the night. Ruth says once they got to their room, she and Dorothy were talking and talking and talking, and then this must have been 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and there was Bill with a pot of coffee. Hank was fast asleep somewhere, but Bill was wide awake and he just couldn't sleep. He had a tray with a pot of coffee and cups in his hands, she said, and we were in a room with one big double bed. So Bill just got in the middle, and there we were. And we talked the rest of the night, the three of us in that position. And that's a quote from Ruth. Their conversation, she said, wandered over everything, and the three of them just enjoyed that night thoroughly. However indecent that might sound, it was actually nothing of the sort. In a letter to Bill Wilson almost 20 years later, Ruth Hawk mentioned the, quote, night the three of us spent in that bedroom in Cornwall, end quote, and called it one of the most satisfying and joyous memories of my life. How wicked that sounds, she said, but how innocent and wonderful it really was. Wilson agreed with her, calling it one of my precious moments. Just so obsessed with enthused about the big book, and it was finally becoming a reality. So this printer was none other than dear old Mr. Blackwell, one of our Christian friends, and Mr. Blackwell said, "How much of a down payment are you going to make? How many books would you like printed?" Well, we said, "We'll be conservative. Let's print 5,000 just to start." Mr. Blackwell asked us what we were going to use for money. We said that we wouldn't need much, just a few $100s on account would be all right. I told you, after all, we're traveling in good company. We're friends of Mr. Rockefeller. Let's not worry about money. So on April 10th, 1939, 4,650 copies of the book Alcoholics Anonymous are printed. 100 copies are delivered to Bill and Hank, with several more copies going to Willard Richardson and Frank Amos, the Rockefeller men. And more copies of the book will be released, but only after some kind of payment has been made later on. This is something that's, I think, important. This is the first book ever printed. On the left-hand side, Bill wrote, note, this was the very first AA book off the press. We used thick paper to make the alcoholics think they were getting their money's worth. So they used thick paper so it'd be a thick book. If they were going to pay $3.50, we wanted it to be a big book. They used small margins and thick paper, and it has ever since been called the Big Book. But on the other side, Bill wrote this. He wrote to Lois, one whose loving care and fortitude in our dark days together made these pages possible. So to her, this first book of the first edition is lovingly and thankfully given, Bill, in memory of the fifth Christmas, 12/25/39. So the best-selling book that saves lives. In 2011, Time magazine included Alcoholics Anonymous on its list of the 100 best and most influential books, written since the magazine was founded in 1923. The following year, the Library of Congress selected the Big Book for its list of the 88 books that shaped America. Despite never being on the bestseller list, Alcoholics Anonymous continues to be one of the best-selling books of all time. Over the years, it has literally been printed by the carloads, and over the 37 million copies have been sold as of 2019. The book, which has been translated into an impressive 70 languages, which sells well in hard copy, despite its ready availability online for free. Most important, however, is the fact that since it was published in early 1939, the Big Book has shown millions of people a precise and proven path to continuous sobriety through a spiritual awakening, allowing them to live a sane, fulfilling, and fruitful lives without alcohol. We have no idea how many millions of recoveries have been affected by Alcoholics Anonymous since the book was published. But if an exact number were known, it would be staggering. A.A. currently reports the fellowship has well over 2 million sober and active alcoholics members. It was the writing and publication of the Big Book, more than anything else, that made all of that possible. And in 1954, at the end of his talk that we've been reading from, Bill said, "Such is the story of the preparation of the book Alcoholics Anonymous and of its subsequent effect. You all have some notion. The proceeds of that book have repeatedly saved the office in New York. And it isn't the money that has come out of it that matters. It is the message that it carried, that transcended the mountains and the sea, and is even at this moment lighting candles This book, even at this moment, is lighting candles in dark caverns and on distant beaches." The book that saves lives. So that's a little bit of writing the Big Book, Bill Wilson, and some history. And I hope you have enjoyed that and learned something from it. And now, if you would like, I'll take any questions that you may have.